Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to my channel. I am Tristan Gabriel, and today I have two very special guests with me, Jacob Berman from History Valley, and none other than Dr. Robert Price, a well-known theologian and critical scholar. He's an author, Deconstructing Jesus, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and I believe Jesus is Dead are three prominent books that he's authored. And I've been a fan of both of these gentlemen. I've learned a whole lot. And this topic today on the authenticity of the Pauline epistles, I believe is historical. I think it's a breakthrough. And I think it's a critique on Christianity that I don't believe most Christians are prepared for. So I'm ready to learn, you guys. I gave a brief introduction, but Jacob, do you want to go ahead and further introduce yourself? And Dr. Price, you can go ahead and follow.
Yes, for those that are unfamiliar, I'm the host of the History Valley podcast, and briefly, I'll just say that what I do is in my journey to seek a better understanding of our ancient past, where religion comes from, the origins of civilization, and as I interview scholars to gain more knowledge to that end, the audience that watches the videos, the content that I do, they learn as I do. They learn alongside me. That's what I do.
Very nice. Dr. Price, did you want to go ahead and further add any other input when I introduce?
Well, I guess not. I do the Bible Geek, or I have done it, and I'm about to start it up again. The podcast, the Bible Geek, where I field any sort of a question, usually on the Bible or theology or other religions or whatever. I've been doing that for some 20 years on and off, and it's what I always wanted to do ever since I listened as a teenager to a show on the radio called Bible Answer Man. And I thought, oh man, this is so great. I'd love to do it. And now I am. So I do that. I write articles and publish stuff, including fantasy and horror stories. I'm a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, Lynn Carter, and others. So I stay pretty busy clacking the keys on the computer and shooting my mouth off online. And it's great fun.
Very nice, very nice. And yeah, that could definitely be time consuming. It could take up a lot of energy, and it could
Mm.
definitely stifle your peace. Ththese online battles, it
Good.
happens. But yeah, but today, I'm honored to have a live discussion, on this topic, the authenticity of the Pauline epistles. Now, last time I had a discussion with Jacob, he clarified he believes every single epistle from Paul is a forgery. And I just want to delve right into it, you guys. I mean, let's talk about this. I mean, well, here's the question: how do we address this to Christian apologists? What has been your experience with this, and what do you see like the future of this critique? I mean, this is an angle in Christian apologetics I don't think most Christians are ready for. But what's your take on it?
Well, I think you're right. They don't know what to make of it, and I've participated uh, for some years in the Jesus seminar and the Paul seminar of the West Star Institute. And the very first time I went back in 1994, I commented that it seemed to me that the scholars were perfectly willing, so to speak, to throw Jesus to the historical Jesus to the wolves, because and but they were really resistant to the idea that Paul did not write at least what I call the lucky seven epistles. Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and First Thessalonians. That's seven. There are six more of them in the canon, and they found various reasons to think that they're inauthentic. Reasons I agree with, but I found it ironic that if you applied the same criteria, you would dismiss all of them. They all had anachronisms, it seemed to me. The most natural reading, anyway, for instance, in uh, Galatians, it certainly seems to be referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, not in so many words, but certainly implied. And that would say that, assuming that Paul kicked the bucket in the early 60s, this can't be by him. And between that one and 1 Corinthians 15, you've got a glaring contradiction. In Galatians, the supposed author, Paul, is saying that he owes nothing to any human predecessor. He got his gospel directly from the heavenly Christ. But in 1 Corinthians 15, he said, here's the gospel as I preached to you, and I received it from my predecessor. Wait a minute. I spent a whole phone debate with my pal, Gary Habermas, debating this. I said, these things are just opposites to one another. You can't harmonize them. And I couldn't get anywhere with him. He and Mike Licona, both of whom are brilliant and very fine guys, not really axe grinders, but they could not think out of a conservative box. And you can show the same sort of thing as Willem Christian van Manen showed in the 19th century, and Bruno Bauer and several others, that the Pauline epistles are just filled with telltale marks. Now, so my operating assumption, ever since I studied this stuff, was that, yeah, I think Paul did not write these, which shouldn't be a surprise, number one, because most critical scholars are willing to admit he didn't write half of them. I mean, that implies it was a cottage industry to be cranking out these fake Pauline epistles. If 6, why not all 13? And the epistles themselves warn, hey, now don't read any epistle as if written by me. What? Or how about this? Note the large letters I'm writing. This is the mark of authenticity in all my letters. That alone tells you that there were loads of fake Pauline epistles, and this is probably one of them. And so my model has been to say, yeah, these things should be read as post-Pauline writings by Paulinists, people that held Paul in reverence, but interpreted him in different ways. And that each one of these letters was probably a patchwork, which explains why, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, probably the worst of the bunch in this regard, each chapter seems to be followed by another one that refutes it again and again. That can an apostle get financial support from those he preaches to? Oh, of course, but no, he can't. Should a Christian eat food offered to idols? Sure, what the heck? It's just meat. No, don't do it. God will kill you if you do. What? Can women prophesy and pray in public? Oh, sure they can. In one chapter, it'll tell them to shut up. In another chapter, what's going on? So, and just to sum this up, I don't say that the traditional view that all or half of the epistles with his name on them were not written by Paul. We don't know that. It's a question of what paradigm seems to be most fruitful in making sense of the various statements of the text. So there's that one, but then there's the traditional one. Yeah, he did write them, at least the big 7. And so in one book, I did a kind of quickie commentary on all of the epistles on the assumption that he did write the 7. But then in another book, I said, okay, let's try the other view on for size. What sense would it make if we said, no, they're all post-Pauline? Well, you don't really have to twist the text beyond recognition to take either approach. So, though we have this neurotic anxiety, oh, no, we've got to settle these questions. There has to be an orthodoxy, even if it's a critical orthodoxy. Hey, I'm sorry, but that's not the way it works. All these theories we have to be considered tentative and provisional and no more than unproven paradigms. And so I feel that way about different theories of the historical Jesus. We'll never know this unless Elon Musk invents a time machine, which maybe he's doing right now, who knows? But short of that, how would you know? And so I think to be an honest critic or scholar, you have to leave your preferences at the door. And neither of the major ways of interpreting these epistles are absurd. You can't prove them right or wrong. So I'm just juggling, basically. And I find all the theories fascinating.
Wow, very, very informative, Dr. Price. Jacob, I knew a lot of things were just coming up into mind with a lot of the statements and the input that Dr. Price gave. Do you want to further add on to some of the comments that he made?
Sure, I guess I'll talk about my theory.
Perfect time.
Yeah. So I agree with him that there are contradictions in the Pauline epistles, and that is a problem. And I want to add to his comment that 1 Corinthians actually self-contradicts itself, actually, on if Paul received from men or not. It can't even agree with itself. Not to mention the massive contradiction between Galatians and 1 Corinthians that Bob did mention. In 1 Corinthians 15, you have Paul saying that he gets... Really, it's Paul and Sosthenes. It's not just Paul. We forget so often, not me, but a lot of people don't pay attention that these letters are co-authored. Right out the gate, if there's one thing that we can be certain on that isn't a theory, is that the majority of these letters under Paul's name claim to be multi-authored text. And you look at and you read the beginning of those letters, that's what they're telling you. These are co-authored materials. And the other ones are being put on the same pedestal with Paul. These are co-authors. These are not merely scribes. They are equal contributors to these texts, just like the Paul of the letters was. Now, why is that important? Well, here's what's interesting. One of the things that needs to be paid attention to is if you look at 1, 2 Timothy, Galatians, and Ephesians and Titus. Those are the single authored letters. And I'm leaving Hebrews out because Hebrews isn't by Paul. And I try to think about what I mean by Paul is the Paul of the letters. I used to wonder if he was, but I moved away from that. And in the final form of my paper that I'm nearly done editing, I'm gonna give my theory, my best guess as to who may have written Hebrews, but that's another story. Anyway, when you look at these letters, they don't really contradict each other. Titus, 1 and 2 Timothy, Galatians, and Ephesians, they don't really contradict each other. They really don't. And I think Bob, I think you see where I'm going with this, Bob. The contradictions are with the co-authored letters.
That makes a lot of sense. It improves my remarks, my theory.
I'll give an example. Bob, you mentioned about women being quiet in the church. That's something that 1 Timothy says. But that statement is also in 1 Corinthians. I believe it's in 1 Corinthians 14.
Yes. Sure.
It moves around depending on the manuscript.
Yeah.
But it's there. It's there all the same. I'm very hyper skeptical about interpolation claims, as I think you both know. So unless there's manuscript evidence or just an external witness that says it wasn't there, I don't buy it. So I treat it as if it's there. I think what is debatable about that is where that verse could be located in the original 1 Corinthians, but it was there all the same. Why am I bringing this point up? So in Romans is actually co-authored. It was co-written by Tertius, but Tertius adds himself in Romans 16. So he doesn't put himself at the beginning, unlike the other co-authors, which is interesting. Now, Romans talks about female leadership and that it's okay. That's totally okay. It's not against that. It's not against women talking in church. So Romans is contradicting 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. So I think the pseudo Paul, that the Paul of the letters, was the one that wanted women not to talk in church, but Tertius, he was okay with it. That's why in Romans is okay with it, but in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, those letters aren't. So there's a contradiction there because you have co-authors saying different things. And sometimes the co-authors will contradict each other in the same letter. So it's a co-authored anthology. Now let's go to 1 Clement. 1 Clement is our earliest evidence, in my view, because I think it was written by the consul Titus Fabius Clemens. I see it as genuine. 1 Clement doesn't know anything about co-authors in Paul's letters. There's no co-authors in these texts. Now, some will try to make that line up with Marcion priority, that the Marcionite letters are earlier. Marcion's Paul does not have co-authors in it. I disagree. I think it actually is an indicator to reverse, because I don't buy Marcion priority. I think Marcion did tear down the New Testament and remove the co-authors because he thought Paul was the only true authority. So, well, I think that fits in line with Paul and Seneca, 3 Corinthians, the non-Marcionite Latin Laodiceans, and the Epistle to the Alexandrians. All of these texts are forgeries. Everybody agrees that those are forgeries. Even apologists agree that those are forgeries. All of those forgeries in Paul's name lack co-authors. So while they don't agree with Marcion's theology, they are following suit in removing co-authors, so that way Paul himself is the author alone. There is no co-author. And I talk about that in my paper. And so I think that that's actually evidence of Marcion's text being secondary. Now back to 1 Clement. Oh, I should note that Marcion's text came out in 144 CE to give chronological clarification. And 1 Clement, I date 1 Clement to around 93 CE. The standard view would put it more like 96 CE, but I'm not that far off. I just think there's reasons to think it was a couple of years earlier, 3 years earlier. The reason why is because the beginning, if you read around the beginning of 1 Clement, it talks about how another persecution has befallen them. And so I think that the way that Clement's writing that is that Clement is trying to say that he's writing at the beginning of Domitian's persecution, which started in 93 CE. So that's why I think he wrote in that year. But anyway, 1 Clement never mentions co-authors. He talks about Paul writing a letter, epistolon, a letter. But in 2 Peter uses the word epistoles, letters, plural, because 2 Peter wants the reader to understand, I know them all. I don't just know a letter. Now, Bob mentioned earlier about the letters of Paul talking about forgeries. That's in 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians says that beware, don't believe a letter. It's interesting. It says a letter, not letters, a letter, as if it were from us, not me, us. 2 Thessalonians is 3 authors, by the way. That's why it's put that way. Us. 3 people wrote 2 Thessalonians. 3 people wrote 1 Thessalonians. That's why there's contradictions in the eschaton, because you have co-authors having different opinions about how to express the parousia. To that end, we go to 1 Clement. Read that whole thing. It's a long letter, but read that entire thing. And guess what you don't see? Where is the parousia? Clement goes through the Old Testament to try to find the parousia. And he's not trying to find any evidence of a second coming of Jesus. He never mentions the second coming of Jesus. He talks about the coming of the kingdom of God. The standard view might interpret Clement as saying, oh, he's just ignoring the parousia of Christ because Clement, because of the delayed parousia, the problem that Jesus didn't come back in 70. He didn't come back in the first century. Now, some people will try to say that one Clement isn't by Clement, I think, for very bad reasons. I think it's more like wishful thinking, wanting to dismiss it, rather than actually seeing the problem. Because if you look at Clement, it's massively ignorant of the New Testament. How can you say that Paul wrote a letter and not mention the letters? How can you not talk about the co-authors, Sosthenes, Timothy, Silas, and Tertius? How can you not talk about them? That's absurd. And to make it even worse, where is the parousia of Christ? How can you not talk about that? How can you go to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Proverbs, which is what Clement does, and other books, to talk about the coming of the kingdom? He quote mines the Old Testament to talk about the coming of the kingdom of God. Where is the second coming of Jesus? It's not there at all. It's not even an idea to be concerned with. Not something that it's not. If this was a delayed parousia that Clement was dealing with, he would have talked about it and give reasons as to why Jesus didn't come back yet. Oh, we just misinterpreted the text. He doesn't say anything like that. I think that actually adds additional evidence that it's actually genuine, instead of being evidence against. Because if Clement's a forgery written around, I don't know, 150, because some people put it that late or even later, how can you ignore all that material, which was definitely floating around by that time? So then that brings me to the next point. What was Clement talking about? The second persecution, like I mentioned earlier, it was Domitian's persecution, but there's more to it than that. 2 Thessalonians talks about a person called the son of lawlessness. The son of lawlessness is a character that is persecuting the followers of Jesus. He's persecuting both Jews and Christians, and he's declaring himself to be a deity. That's what he does. And what's interesting about that is there's only one person in the first century that fits all of those characteristics, and that was Emperor Domitian. Now, some will try to say it was Emperor Caligula, but there's only one big problem with that. Well, it's actually a couple of problems. One of them is, and I think it's the biggest problem, Caligula does not persecute Jews and Christians like Domitian did. There is no armed crackdown against Jews and Christians. You see that with Domitian. You don't see that combination with Caligula at all. That's a problem. If you search through the church fathers, you comb through them, where do you see anything about martyrdoms under Caligula? Nothing. Nobody's saying Caligula killed any saint, any major Christian leader. There's no discussion of it. But you see that with Domitian. So, the son of lawlessness, I conclude, is Domitian. And others have seen the parallels with Domitian as well, but I'm taking it in a different direction. Domitian was assassinated by a person called Stephanos in 96 E. Now, I've kind of jumped ahead there. There's a couple of people before that, a couple of people that I want to talk about, whom were killed by Emperor Domitian. That is Epaphroditus and Clement, in that order. Epaphroditus goes, and then Clement goes next. And some people go around trying to spread this nonsense that there was no Domitianic persecution, which I think is absurd. We have massive evidence that it happened. And the 2 Thessalonians is talking about him in code, the son of lawlessness, because you're not going to name the emperor outright. And the other reason they're not going to name him outright is because in 2 Thessalonians, the son of lawlessness is going to be killed by Jesus. That's what it says. So Jesus is going to come back. He's going to take him out. Now, if you go look at Dio Cassius and Suetonius, what they say is, if you go through those texts, you can see evidence that there is you see that Domitian's having these people arrested, and he's trying to come up with excuses to kill them. He's not saying, oh, they're planning my death. I think he suspected that they were planning his death, but because he couldn't prove it, he came up with other reasons to have them eliminated. With Epaphroditus, he has Epaphroditus killed in 95 CE because, and he'll say it's because he was involved in Emperor Nero's suicide, which is ridiculous. Nero died decades ago. Why would Emperor Domitian have him killed then? That doesn't make any sense. There's obviously another motive there. The same thing happens with the same kind of absurd thing happens with Titus Flavius Clemens. He is killed next, not because of Nero, not because of anything to do with Nero. With Clemens' case, if you look at Dio Cassius, he is killed for succumbing to Jewish ways. He was charged with atheism because he has succumbed to Jewish ways, which is kind of like what happened to Clement of Rome, which to me is like the mythical version of Titus Fabius Clemens. Clement of Rome was killed because because of Emperor Trajan, supposedly, and we're given this story by Eusebius. Before Eusebius, we're not presented any contradictory evidence about why this Clement of Rome couldn't have been Titus Fabius Clemens, unless you depend on Eusebius. So to me, it's unlikely that Clement and Clemens are two different people killed in very similar circumstances at the same time. I think it's the same guy, and there's even a common connection between them with Domitilla. But I'm not going to get into all that. So if you look at going back to 2 Thessalonians, there's this plot to kill the son of lawlessness. And Emperor Domitian also declared himself to be a deity, just like the son of lawlessness does. And they were both killed. And Jesus is going to come back. That's the important thing. He's going to come back to eliminate the son of lawlessness. Now, Clement and Epaphroditus, well, Epaphroditus goes first, and then Clement, just to keep it straight there. They both were killed in 95 very quickly, shortly apart from one another. And in 1 Thessalonians, it also talks about the parousia happening during a time of persecution, just like 2 Thessalonians does. But 2 Thessalonians describes it differently, not necessarily contradicting it. The only major contradiction, well, there's a few, but the major one there to talk about is 2 Thessalonians appears to be talking about it you can interpret it as talking about it in a delayed way. Because the 1 Thessalonians is more immediate, whereas it's not put that way in 2 Thessalonians. Which is ironic, because I think both letters are written nearly at the same time. I think both 1 and 2 Thessalonians are written in 94 CE. And I think what happened is the co-authors had different opinions on how to disguise the plot to assassinate Domitian. That's what I think is going on. These are different opinions about how to disguise the plot to assassinate Domitian using the parousia. If you talk about Jesus coming back to kill the son of lawlessness, then it's harder to prove that it's going to be the emperor Domitian. That's why it was being talked about in those terms. And if you look at Philippians, where Epaphroditus and Clement are both mentioned, Epaphroditus and Clement are both mentioned in Philippians, and Philippians talks about Caesar's household. If you look at the entire first century, when do you see an Epaphroditus and a Clement mentioned like that in the same text in connection with Caesar's household? Only in the 90s. You don't see that before the 90s. There's no other example of this before the 90s. This is talking about the same Epaphroditus and Clemens during the time of Emperor Domitian, the end of the Flavian era. So, or it should say toward the end of the Flavian era. The Domitian's reign was the last reign of the Flavians. So when you look at the prison letters and you ask yourself, why is this Paul being arrested? Why was he taken into custody? I don't view Ephesians as a literal prison letter, because in Ephesians, the way that the pseudo Paul talks about himself is that he is he's imprisoned. The way his imprisonment is talked about is it's like a mental imprisonment. He says he was imprisoned for the sake of the Gentiles, something that is not said in the other prison letters, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. That's only said in Ephesians. That's what makes that letter stand out from those other three prison letters, which I think are a more of a literal imprisonment. Now, one thing I'll say is Domitian's persecution was primarily against philosophers, but Jews and Christians and Jewish converts, like Clemens, were caught in the middle. And what's happening is, you see that in Colossians and Philippians and Philemon, you have Epaphroditus also being imprisoned too. But Clement wasn't mentioned as being imprisoned yet, which is interesting. That actually agrees with the chronology that we're given in Suetonius and Dio Cassius, because Clement was killed after Epaphroditus. He was not imprisoned at the same time with Epaphroditus. Now, here's the thing, before I continue. Many will resist the idea, as they've already been doing. I'm not the first one to argue that Titus Flavius Clemens is Clement of Rome. They'll resist it, despite the evidence being strong for it, because of very bad reasons. I really can't really put it in any other way. Because the evidence that it's the same guy is extremely powerful. There's not really a reason to reject it. But it's the same nonsense. The Domitianic persecution didn't happen. To me, that's like flat earth. It's if you say that the Domitianic persecution didn't happen, is Dio Cassius and Suetonius lying? Are they making stuff up too? I don't think so. Why was Titus Flavius Clemens charged with succumbing to Jewish ways if the Domitianic persecution never happened? We don't question that. What I mean by we is people reading Dio Cassius don't question that, but then they'll still parrot the same nonsense that the persecution never happened. And even if one still believes that the 7 letters are by Paul, which is fine, if they want to, 2 Thessalonians is still talking about Domitian, regardless if those 7 letters are by Paul, the other 7 letters are by Paul or not. So anyway,
Dr. Price, did you want to go ahead and interject? It looks like he's touched on some of the points you made and added on some further information. Anything that grasped your attention during that discourse?
Yeah, the idea that some people say that Domitian didn't have this persecution. I came into contact with this idea in studying the book of Revelation, where you used to have commentators all saying that John is trying to prepare his readers for a great persecution on the horizon, and that must have been the persecution of Domitian. But some will say, well, there's not really any definite evidence that there was such a thing. And I think of the life of Apollonius of Tyana, who was a miracle-working philosopher who was arrested by Domitian and all that. I think, why are they saying this? I mean, it seems like there is evidence for this Domitianic persecution, and I don't know, but I have a hunch somebody has, as part of their agenda, to move Revelation from the end of the 1st century some way, and they know they've got to chip away at the identification of Domitian with the beast, because also the book seems to describe the beast in terms of the Emperor Nero, and the legend that though killed, he by his own troops, he would rise from the dead and come back to destroy Rome in vengeance, or that he didn't get killed and he managed to sneak out and he's coming back and so forth. And that 666, you know who I mean. He says that works out to Neron Caesar. And I can see that. I mean, but the other view makes sense too, because the idea of Nero redivivus, the idea that Nero, dead or escaped, would come back. And so and the thing about the seven heads of the beast, they represent different Roman emperors. One that had a mortal wound, but it was healed. So he is the last one, but one of the previous ones. That seems to be clear, if anything in Revelation is a reference to the this idea that the Antichrist is both Nero and Domitian. It's a second coming of Nero, and so if you wanted to say, okay, it was really written in the time of Nero, so forget about the idea that John is talking about a persecution led by Domitian. It just seems to me maybe that's axe grinding. Though I tend to go with the very late first century date and the identification of Nero and Domitian. So all of that's, I know it sounds like, like a Kamala Harris speech, no logic to it or anything. But the gist of what I'm saying is, it's the denial of a Domitianic persecution seems a little too convenient for some people's theories, and I find it unconvincing. So I agree with Jacob about that. There's debate that there needn't be about it. One important thing about Jacob's theory that sheds a little bit more light on it is the question of who is the Paul. Even if he was not the only author of these letters, some supposed Paul was one of the epistle writers. But if there are references to things after the traditional date of Paul's death, who is the one who later wrote these letters? If they're pseudepigrapha, if they're forged letters after the death of Paul, is it possible that there was another Paul, whether literally or figuratively? And Jacob's the only one, I never even heard of this before, but Jacob's the only one that says, wait a second, Jerome says that Paul was born in Giscala in Galilee, and after the Roman war. And why would he say this? I mean, Jerome was the great scholar of the early church. Is it possible he knows what he's talking about, but doesn't happen to clarify it for ignoramuses like we are so many centuries later? And Jacob said, well, yeah, there's somebody writing much later than the historical Paul, and in his name, and son of a gun again, like, I never heard of that. But what else are you going to conclude? There's what was Jerome drunk or half asleep when he wrote that? No,
and Jerome didn't write it. Sorry to
cited,
interject. Yeah, he was citing Epaphroditus.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's it. And that is fascinating. That's really an important card in the game. And it does bring up the question, well, what do you mean when you say Paul didn't write these letters? Well, if there's more than one Paul, oh my God, what are the chances of ever pegging the right guy?
The closest thing that someone before me has gotten to saying what I'm saying about that is Paul George. But Paul George thinks that the historical Paul and Saul from Giscala are the same person. That I don't agree with.
Yeah, you got a big problem there. I mean, even if they're different people, that's problematical, but I don't see how you can deny it. And what this theory, it just doesn't seem, Paul George's view, to me has a bigger, it's like Sisyphus rolling the boulder uphill. I don't know how you're going to get that established.
Now, what I like about his work is he does date Paul's letters after 70. Not entirely for the same reasons that I do, for different reasons. But he tries to make Saul from Giscala and Paul the same person, which I respectfully disagree with. I see Saul from Giscala as being pseudo Paul of the letters, as a distinct person from the historical Paul, who I think died around 39 CE. Now, let me clarify something, because some people are going to misinterpret what I'm saying, despite how specific I was earlier. If that is, I'm not claiming that Domitian was primarily targeting Christians.
Right.
We do not have a text that, outside of from, I guess, church fathers, that actually says that. All I need to prove my point is Dio Cassius, that Clemens was charged for converting to Judaism as an excuse for having him killed. Nonetheless, I think the Christians did not like what Domitian was doing to the philosophers. I also think they were pissed off about some of them being killed because, like I said earlier, they were caught in the middle. They weren't the primary targets, but they were caught in the middle. I've said this before. And you know I've said that before, Bob. They were caught in the middle. Now, that's still a persecution, whether anybody likes it or not. Now, is it the same way that apologists will talk about? No. Do I agree that apologists exaggerate it? Yes, they do. You won't get an argument from me about that. Now, that doesn't change anything about the son of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians. And I also want to mention Revelations talked about in this too, because Revelation is similar to 2 Thessalonians, at least to some degree. Now, what will happen is somebody will just say, well, there's a hypothetical version of Revelation that was earlier, and I don't buy that layer cake theory stuff about these texts. Unproven theoretical drafts, different versions of these texts that are hypothetical about manuscript or external witnesses. I don't believe in any of that stuff. We can't work from it. It's funny to me because these are the same people that will try to say the entire persecution is made up. Even they wouldn't even buy the idea that some of them are caught in the middle. But yet they'll also still say Revelation can be evidence for it, which is mind-boggling to me. I'm like, what are you saying then? I'm talking about these other people that I've talked to in the past about this and including behind the scenes. I'm like, this is very confusing to me. I'm like, make up your mind. Anyway, is there evidence or is there no evidence for it? So anyway, that's all extremely confusing and it's difficult to deal with. But back to what I'm trying to say, and that is, I think that these people were in cahoots together. They had a plot to kill Domitian, and why they did it, I just think they didn't like the guy. They felt like somebody else should be in charge. Maybe they thought Clement should be in charge, Clemens, because he would be, since he was a Flavian, he'd be a potential candidate to be in line, but that's ruled out because he gets whacked. He gets executed by the order of Domitian, so he's out of the game. And not long after that, then Stephanos stabs Domitian to death. In fact, they stab each other to death. And when you look at Philippians and Philemon, what's interesting about those letters, those prison letters, is you have this expectation of, I'm going to be released soon. What's funny is Christian apologists will read this and they'll say, that's Nero about to be beheaded. I'm like, this guy does not expect to die at all. I'm going to be released soon. Why would he say that? Why would the Paul of the letters say such a thing like that? What's the deal with that? Well, the people that were persecuted by Domitian, they were released from custody when Emperor Nerva came to power. When you get to 2 Timothy, which many scholars agree isn't by Paul. The epistolary Paul says he says about Onesiphorus that he thanks him for visiting him when he was in the chain. That's a really odd thing to write if that's about to be a beheaded Paul. Oh, my imprisonment was in the past. Like, well, that's a strange thing to write. Unless it really did happen in the past. And you go to 2 Corinthians, it actually talks about Paul's imprisonments as a past tense scenario.
Yeah, that's right.
That's why I argue in my paper that the prison letters are before 2 Corinthians. Because 2 Corinthians is talking about it in the past tense. The only one I don't think was written before 2 Corinthians was Ephesians, because I view Ephesians as a not so literal imprisonment. Because in Ephesians he talks about, I think he's talking about how he's sick of preaching the message of Christ, and he's kind of getting mad and upset about it. It's a mental imprisonment, and he was imprisoned for the sake of the Gentiles. And the way he talks about it is like his preaching, his work is the imprisonment. And when you get to 2 Timothy, which is his last letter, he's sick of it. He says, "I fought the good fight, everybody. I'm out." And I think it was written between 1 and 2 Timothy, because in Ephesians, he's pseudo Paul sends Tychicus to Ephesus. But in 2 Timothy, he's there.
Mm-hmm.
He's there. It's like, okay, so that implies to me that Ephesians is written between 1 and 2 Timothy. That's my take on that. And again, just so we can keep track here, so everybody can keep track here, I'm saying Saul from Giscala wrote these letters in the 90s, not the actual Paul the Apostle that 1 Clement is talking about. 1 Clement's Paul died many decades ago. He was killed, actually, by envious men, according to 1 Clement. He was killed in the furthest west of the empire, which is Hispania. That's where he was killed. I put his death in 39. I'll come back to that later about why I think he was killed in 39 CE. Anyway, and it wasn't by Romans, by the way. Clement says nothing about Romans killing him. That nonsense comes from Lucius Carinus's work, The Acts of Paul. But I need to come back to Domitian for a second. So when Domitian is killed, what do you see? The concern in Paul's these so-called Pauline letters, it just suddenly shifts. There's no concern about imprisonment anymore, not really. And now they're talking about going around and preaching all over the empire. You see this in Romans. So, like, what gives? What is this sudden shift? So when you talk about imprisonment, release, spreading the message across the empire, that fits a lot better in Domitian's time and just after. That combination of stuff doesn't make sense earlier than that. And to me, it doesn't even make sense later than that. It just makes better sense in 94, 97 of the Common Era, end of the 1st century, basically, not later. And to me, that explains why Clement knew nothing about the second coming of Christ. He knew nothing about it because 1 Clement was written before the entire New Testament, which is a radical take. In fact, much of what I'm saying is radical. Anyway, I don't pretend that it isn't. Clement knows nothing about the second coming of Christ because it hadn't been invented yet. The idea hasn't been discussed yet. And when you look at Josephus in the Testimonium, which I do think is entirely genuine, and I know we disagree on that, Josephus does not mention the second coming. Oh, and the Christians believe he will return. He never says that. I feel like if somebody interpolated it in the 4th century, I feel like that would have been something to put in there, but they didn't. Assuming it was interpolated, I don't think it was, but Josephus says nothing of it. Clement says nothing of it. He has to go mine the Old Testament to even talk about a coming of anything at all, of any kind. Never about the second coming of Jesus. I suppose the closest thing he gets to it is when he talks about Jesus being the first fruits of the resurrection. He does mention that. But that's it. He never says Jesus is going to come back and there's going to be a massive resurrection initiated by him. Never says this. So given all that, Tristan, were you about to say something? Okay. So given all that, then what did the historical Paul write? If the letters are concerned with the political catastrophe of the final years of Domitian's reign and the aftermath of it, then who is the historical Paul? When did he die? I mentioned a couple of times earlier that I think Paul was killed in 39 in Spain, Hispania. Now I'm going to talk about why. In 1 Clement, we're told that Paul went furthest west of the empire. He wrote a letter, and the letter has some parallel to the content in 1 Corinthians, in which he notes, I view it as a report. I don't actually think the real historical Paul was I don't think he converted at all. I don't think he believed in Jesus in any way, shape, or form. Clement talks about Paul's faith, and that's it. You can interpret what he meant by faith in different ways. To me, he doesn't really say what his faith was. So you'll probably know where I'm going with that. So Clement talks about that Paul noted that there was division in the church, different parties led by Cephas and Apollos. That's it. Now, the standard view is that 1 Clement knew 1 Corinthians. We got a problem with that. Tristan, in our previous show that we did together, I mentioned that 1 Clement, in fact, contradicts the letters in several ways. For one thing, and this can be understood even if somebody decidedly disagrees with me about Titus Fabius Clemens being Clement of Rome, this, in fact, would not contradict my point. You can disagree with me on that and still see the problem here, and that is, in 1 Clement never mentions that he knew Paul. He said Paul died a long time ago, never said he met him. But in Philippians, Paul and Clement are personally familiar with each other. That's an odd thing for Clement to leave out. Did he forget he met Paul? That's ridiculous to me. No, he couldn't have. To make it worse, Fortunatus is mentioned in 1 Clement. Near the end of 1 Clement, actually. Like, I think it's at the verse before, like the immediate verse before the end. And he says that Fortunatus is alive. He doesn't say that he's dead. He's living in his time. What's he doing living in the 90s? You have to be a pretty old man if that's true. Suppose it's possible. Except what rules that out is that Fortunatus never met Paul. Clement never mentions it. That's how I can tell he never met Paul. But in 1 Corinthians, Fortunatus and Paul knew each other. Now, somebody might say, and it's a very convenient thing to say, different Clement, different Fortunatus. I'm like, really? Well, guess who Clement wrote to? The Corinthians. Clement's letter is written to the Corinthians. Is that just some freak coincidence too? And they both mention Fortunatus? Are you kidding me? No, it's obviously the same guy. But in 1 Corinthians, Fortunatus is being embellished. Now he knows Paul when he didn't. Philippians, now Clement and Paul know each other when they didn't. These are anachronisms. These people are being placed into the past. They're taking the Domitianic context of these letters and placing them back in the 50s. And I suspect they're really trying to put them more like in the 30s. Which I can kind of see why Gerd Ludemann thought. Because Gerd Ludemann, he dates Paul's letters earlier in his interview. He puts them in the 30s. At least he puts 1 Thessalonians in the 30s. So he's dating these texts super, super early. And I can see why he does. If you believe 2 Corinthians about this whole King Aretas was chasing me around bit, 2 Corinthians being put in the 30s is understandable if you believe that Paul really wrote that. You'd have to believe that Paul is bad at history, though. because King Aretas IV never controlled Damascus. What did he? Did he just have some? Was he being chased around by other people and mistakenly thought it was Aretas? I don't think so. When you read Josephus never mentions King Aretas IV controlled Damascus. Abraham Negev demolishes the standard view on this. He points out that there is no archaeological evidence to explain a Nabatean ruler controlling Damascus in the 30s, the late 30s. And so that right there just levels the idea that King Aretas IV ever controlled Damascus, not to mention the fact that Josephus mentions King Aretas III controlled Damascus 100 years earlier. Which shows me 2 Corinthians made a mistake. No different than Acts makes a mistake in placing Theudas after Judas of Galilean's death. So if we can see that Acts makes a mistake there, why can't we see that 2 Corinthians made the same mistake? But in my opinion, 2 Corinthians mistake is worse. It put King Aretas in the wrong century. That's a bigger blunder than Acts made. I'll stop there for now.
Very nice. And you guys, we have one super chat and a few other questions. I'll just go ahead and get to them right now. That way we can get those in the comment section more involved. Here was one of the first comments for you, Dr. Price. It looks like they misspelled your name. I'm not sure if that was intentional. Dr. Price is what it says. He says, the way with explaining is how I wish I could have talked to my elders when I was a kid growing up in a Southern Baptist fundy church. Walking away at age 24, never looked back, mid-50s now. We have another one here for you, Jacob. What is the evidence that Domitian persecuted specifically Christians? I know that you talked about it. I just want to go ahead and address the question. What is the source for that?
I didn't even make that claim.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why. He has to rewatch this entire show.
Okay.
I said Christians were caught in the middle multiple times in this stream. That they were not the primary targets. And Titus Flavius Clemens was killed. I think what really happened was Domitian was very paranoid. He was killing all kinds of people. His specific target was philosophers. And it was quite indiscriminate. He was targeting multiple groups of people, not just any one. So we can pass up this question. I think I've answered that.
Okay. From the same person, here is the $10 super chat, Dr. Price. What do you think of Nina Lives? Yeah, thank you for the super chat. What do you think of Nina Livesey's contention that Acts was written before the Pauline epistles? Bruno Bear thought the same thing.
Bauer.
That's right, Bruno Bauer.
Yeah, I'm uncertain about that because you can make plausible cases for either that Acts is making glancing or purposely altered references to Acts, but you can, which I think Richard Purvo argued also, but others like I think, oh boy, wow, can't too late. I can't think of the guy's name. Another scholar thought that no, Acts doesn't know the epistles, and if it did, why does Paul sound so different there than he does in the letters? But there's a decent rejoinder to that a la F.C. Bauer, Acts is not concerned to present an accurate portrait of Paul, such as we would find in the epistles if he really wrote them, but rather a sanitized, Catholicized Paul, because Acts is an attempt to get the rival factions of Petrine and Jamesian Jewish Christianity that still observe the Torah on the one hand, and on the other, the Hellenistic Christianity of Apollos, Priscilla, Aquila, and others who thought, oh, it's fine for Jewish Christians, but you Gentiles, there's no reason you should have to start keeping the Jewish regulations. That's not what saves even Jews. Either way, don't we all realize we're saved by the grace of Christ and so on? And so that you could say Acts is subsequent, and it distorts Paul so as to salve the wound that existed, that their Catholicizing unification is an attempt to bring about, let's all be one big happy family, which seems to have worked, except that, as with all unity plans among different religious groups, you don't go from two to one, but rather from two to three, because you're going to cause split offs. Those who don't want to go with the new the new arrangement, in this case, half Pauline, half Petrine Catholicism. There were holdouts. Marcionites and Gnostics were more traditional pre-Acts Paulinists, and the Ebionites might have taken Jewish Christianity to an extreme. And so you can really plug Acts in before or after. And to me, the arguments both sound reasonable. So I don't know what to say about that. I still have a lot of thinking to do on it. But Nina Libsey, her whole book about this, and I mean, she goes farther than I do and says that there was no historical Paul. And even van Manen, the king of the Dutch radicals, who said Paul wrote none of the letters, even he believed there was a historical Paul. It just had nothing to do with these writings. But she goes like all the way. I'm eager to contact her. I've had no contact with her so far, but she's really a radical. I mean, I'm almost like Jerry Falwell compared to her.
And I'd like to respond. I know
Sure.
that Ken wasn't asking me a question, but it
Sure.
is in line with it, and that is, I see Acts as correcting mistakes in 2 Corinthians and other letters as well. Like, you look at well, let me correct myself. I'm not the other letters. Acts is trying to correct the mistake in 2 Corinthians. I actually don't know if Acts corrects other details in the other letters. I didn't really think about it, but I also want to clarify something I said earlier, and I'll get to that in a second. But in Acts, Paul flees from Jews. In my paper, I talk about Nina Livesey's idea that Acts is before Paul's letters and why I disagree with her. And that is, Acts is correcting the error in 2 Corinthians. If you go through Acts, you notice that King Aretas is never mentioned. Now, I also know that Luke had a literary agenda there, and I think what's happening is that Luke has, he had 2 goals. For one thing, and I think this is the most important one for him, or at least equally important, he wanted to correct the error in 2 Corinthians because he knows that King Aretas IV never controlled Damascus. And so what he does is he says that Paul fled from Jews instead of Aretas. That's what Luke says. Also, I think Luke wanted to blame Jews anyway for Paul fleeing, for Paul's flight, for literary reasons. But I think he was trying to correct an error, a historical error in 2 Corinthians. And so I see Acts as being dependent on Paul's letters and not the other way around.
Could well be. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. You guys that are in the comment section, if you guys have any questions for Dr. Price or Jacob, by all means, go ahead and put them in the comment section, and I will be sure to post them. This is very, very insightful, you guys. So let me ask you guys a question. What do you think are If we're trying to, I guess we could use the term evangelize, Christianity, we're trying to bring them to the truth that, hey, listen, we need to take on a critical approach of this that's not inspired by the Holy Spirit. Paul is not the man that you think that he is. What are some of the strong arguments? If you had to like choose maybe two or three, what are the ones that you think that Christianity is going to respect and give here to, and possibly like open up that Pandora's box for investigation and exploration. What are the strong arguments that you think is actually going to stick?
Well, I don't know if they will, but I think there are compelling arguments that should convince people. But whether someone is convinced by any idea in any area has to do with whether they can think outside of the box that they're comfortable in, because people who are determined to believe A are not going to believe the arguments B raises against it. But I think two of the most important uh, features here are the weakness and the internal self contradiction of the Protestant idea of sola scriptura, that yeah, the whole thing is inspired and authoritative, and we take it literally.
Right.
That's not true. Like when people start comparing Paul and James, they'll say, well, this admittedly looks like doesn't agree. So they'll start, well, if you're a Protestant, you'll start twisting the text to James to pretend that he really was saying the same thing as Paul. If you're a Catholic, you'll twist Paul to sound like James. Well, the Catholics are at least admitting that they're interpreting Scripture in accord with tradition, which really means they're using the Bible as a ventriloquist dummy. But so do Protestants, because they are even worse off, because they say, hey, we don't accept non-literal interpretations. If you treat the Bible as allegory or symbolism, you can make it say anything you want, so it becomes a ventriloquist dummy again. Well, look, you're doing that. Don't you see you're doing that whenever you try to harmonize? I mean, you claim the apparent sense of the text is the normative one, what it seems to say without being twisted and so on. But isn't that what you're doing every time you harmonize James and Paul? You're controlling your reading of Scripture by your theology. So it's not, as you say, that you're basing your beliefs on Scripture. No, you approach the text with an ironclad set of beliefs, and you won't allow Scripture to determine them. To interpret them. So your whole thing is ripped apart right at the center. It just doesn't work. It's not like, oh yeah, it's coherent and all that. Whether or not it's true, well, that's an act of faith. No, it doesn't even get that far. You can't say something is even false if it's just incoherent. I mean, it doesn't even come up to the standard of being false. It's just gibberish. And they might as well be speaking in tongues. And in effect, they are. Well, the other thing is let me see here, what was I going to say about, oh boy. I'm such a big mouth, I've made myself forget what I was. Well, that's really good enough. That's just not going to work. Oh, yeah, I know what the other one was. This idea that you critics reject miracle stories as unhistorical just because you don't believe miracles are possible, because you're really a bunch of atheists. If you would accept the possibility that there's an all-powerful God, well, you'd be accepting those miracle stories right down the line. That's, again, false to the point of absurdity, because the point is not that miracles are possible, but rather are legends impossible. If you look at the Bible and say, well, God parted the Red Sea, oh, you don't think he did? Hey, all things are possible for God. Yeah, theoretically, I agree with you. If there's a God, presumably he's omnipotent. But God doesn't necessarily have to have done everything anybody thinks he did. Like, oh, God created the world in 6 days. Don't you believe he could have if he's an all powerful God? Yeah, but he could have created it in 6 minutes. Does that mean he had to have done it? Or Samson, he kills 1,000 men with a rotting jawbone. Picture the scene. How'd he do this? Did the Philistines all line up to be killed? Wham, next, wham, next. It's absurd. The writer just didn't think it through. And so the thing is, don't give me this bunk that we're ruling out these Bible stories as non-factual because we don't believe miracles could happen. It has nothing to do with that. Maybe they can, maybe they do, maybe they have. We'll never know until Musk invents that time machine. But this again is a crucial logical error on which their whole enterprise is based. Oh, we got every reason to just believe everything the Bible says happened because we believe it's possible that it did. That's what it comes down to, and that's just absurd. Maybe he did rise from the dead. Maybe he did separate the waters, but just because it's possible doesn't mean it happened. So those are arguments I think really go to the heart of this. And they're not based on a preference for atheism or a hatred of religion. In both cases, these are just unresolved, gaping problems that they just ignore.
What I'd like to clarify before I forget to is I don't remember if I misspoke earlier, but this is what I meant. That I think what is like flat earth logic, which is ridiculous, is the claim is a sweeping claim that all of Domitian's persecution is fake. And I didn't mean to compare the idea that denying that Domitian persecuted Christians was like that. I meant to say, what I was trying to say is the idea that there was no persecution of any kind against anyone at all, because some people actually say that. Now that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. So anyway, that's what I meant by that. Now, I need to finish what I was saying about what I think about the historical Paul. So I pretty much only believe the Clementine literature when I reconstruct Paul. That's it. I don't believe anything the Epistle says about him. I don't believe anything Acts says about him of any kind. I don't believe anything that those texts say. But I actually do believe a small part of 1 Corinthians is actually by Paul. That's 1 Corinthians 15. Not all of 1 Corinthians 15, but the part where it talks about, according to the scriptures, Jesus appeared to Cephas, to 500, and then James. I think that Paul, I actually think Paul wrote that. Now, what I was saying, the reason I say that is it's a bold claim for somebody to forge that bit, to make that bit up in the 90s and say some of the 500 are still with us now. Because even then, I feel like people could probably check to see if that was actually true. It's like, wait, what are you talking about? We can't find the sum of the 500 are still with us anywhere. Where are they? The sum of the 500. But if it was in the 30s, I think I can see what's going on there. And again, when you read that bit, it doesn't say, you don't have to believe that Paul believed in Jesus for him to write that, actually. What happens is at the end of that bit, you see the letters reintroducing himself in that text. Not reintroducing himself, let me correct myself. I mean to say attaching himself to it. And it seems very out of place. the Greek word ektrometi, out of time. I was born out of time. That's what he says after the appearance to James, which is very odd. I'm like, what? Out of time I was born? I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you trying to say that you're not contemporary? Well, how the hell did you argue with James then? That doesn't make any sense. How did you know him if you didn't live in his era? What is going on here? And by the way, while we're on that, while I'm on that point, 1 Clement never mentions Paul's vision anywhere. Where's Paul's massive vision, his famous vision? I'm not talking about the road to Damascus. Clement obviously doesn't talk about that. He doesn't even mention the vision of any kind involving Paul. Where is his vision? Where is the parousia? Where is Clement's knowledge? Where does Clement know Paul personally? Where does Fortunatus know Paul personally? None of that's in 1 Clement. And it gets to the point to where, okay, 1 Clement's even contradicting these letters, like I said earlier. So what do I think of the historical Paul? I think Paul worked as an assassin for the high priest of Jerusalem. We're essentially told that in the pseudo-Clementine recognitions. Now, somebody's going to freak out and say, oh my goodness, Jacob thinks that Clement of Rome wrote the recognitions. I don't. I think another guy called Clement did in 150. Well, circa 150, so not exactly, but around that time. I'm not going to get into the whole argument. It has to do with the shepherd of Hermas mentioning another guy called Clement who was living in that time. Not going to get into it right now. But that is a different guy who collected text from the 1st century. He pretty much put it together into book 1. And then every other book that follows it. So it's 10 volumes. It's a massive text, the Clementine recognitions. It's a 10-volume text. And I think the only bits of it that I take seriously is in book 1. Why? Because if you go to book 1, chapter 71, around that, you see that it mentions the letters of Zacchaeus. The letters of Zacchaeus is where the recognitions derives its material from regarding Saul, as it calls Paul, Saul's attempt to assassinate James, the brother of Jesus. Now, when did that happen? That happened in 36 CE. I'm going to explain how I know that's at least where it's being placed. The first clue. A few chapters before chapter 70, where the attack is mentioned, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, go to Mount Gerizim and they have a dispute with the Samaritans. And if you're thinking that's the Mount Gerizim incident in Josephus, if any of you have guessed that, you'd be right. The recognitions is giving us a greater insight into that event that Josephus doesn't talk about. And James and John fell silent at the end of the story. Now that's interesting, isn't it? I think it's not directly saying it, but I think they were killed. I suspect they were killed by the Samaritans. Papias of Hierapolis seems to confirm that. A church father that I can't remember the name of right now mentions that he read Papias's text, and in one of Papias's texts, or in Papias's massive work that we've lost, Papias, and only have fragments of, Papias says that John and James, the sons of Zebedee, were killed by Jews. That actually lines up with recognitions perfectly there, because the Samaritans are a group of Jews. They disagree with mainstream Judaism about where the revelation to Moses happened. They say that it happened at Mount Gerizim instead of Mount Sinai. That's one of their major disagreements, among other disagreements. But it's the same story. Now, that's a problem. Luke is telling us something else, and I think Luke's the one that's lying. Luke says that James was killed by Herod Agrippa I. And then that John outlived him for many decades. Like, whoa, hold on. We're getting told very different things. Zacchaeus, back in the 30s, which the recognitions is quoting, he's using his material, is saying that James and John, their lives ended during their dispute with the Samaritans in 36, by the way. That's when that happened. Papias also says that they were killed by Jews. So somebody's lying. Either John was killed with his brother, or he wasn't. Who's right here? And I think Luke's the one that is that we shouldn't trust here. I think Luke's goal, this is also a long story that we don't have time to talk about, but I'll say this briefly. I suspect the reason Luke is saying that John outlived his brother was because his goal was to conflate John the Apostle with John the Elder, John the Presbyter in the 90s. He's opening the door to the possibility of conflating the two Johns as the same person. And we know the church is moving people around, conflating, splitting apart, putting back together different identities. The church fathers talk about some of that too, and it's a mess. I mean, today, some people debate if Peter and Cephas are the same person, which is another long discussion for another time. That's an example of what I'm talking about. There's a massive confusion about these identities that's being debated to this day.
Well, we have another super chat. Thank you for your support. $5 super chat. Any hope for getting pre-Pauline Christianity from early Arminian texts? Their saints created their alphabet. It says ISIS destroying Christian graves, ATM. Any comments on that, gentlemen?
I'm not sure. I don't believe that Armenian texts that we currently have are going to be much help here. I mean, is it possible that there are Armenian texts that are out there that haven't been discovered yet or haven't been translated yet that could give us insights here? Maybe. But at the moment, we lack access to that information, presuming that information exists.
Well, you could say that 3rd Corinthians, which is even to this day considered canonical New Testament by the, I think the Armenian Monophysite church is pretending at least to tell us something about pre-Pauline Christianity, in that it has Paul making objections to what certain Gnosticizing Christians in Corinth, in quotes, are saying, and so Paul is made to defend the virgin birth, etc., etc. And this would imply that that you've got bits and pieces of both early Armenian Christianity already established before Paul is not initially defining it, but is defending it. And with the opponents, it's possible that they would have been thought of as pre-Pauline Christians that are objecting to Paulinism, but that's all speculation. And that is one thing. I mean, I don't know that it was even originally written in Armenia, though it is still considered canonical scripture there today. But it's conceivable you could pick over the chapters of 3rd Corinthians and draw some inferences, though I don't think it would really prove anything. It's all very speculative, but that would be a place to look. I don't know that they have anything else. There may be some apocalyptic texts and the like that are Armenian translations of earlier texts, but they're apparently not Christian from the ones we do have. Apocalypses of so and so. But perhaps I'm not grasping the intent of the question, but I don't. Armenian texts that I know of probably are not helpful for that, unless there's some I don't know of. I'd love to have more information about it if that's the case.
So to finish what I was saying earlier about Paul's death in 39. So first off, I mentioned earlier about the attack on Mount Gerizim. It happened in 36, and we can basically know that from Josephus's text. So that tells me that John, James, the son of Zebedee, they were killed in 36, which means the attack on James, which followed that in the book 1 of the Recognitions, was really from Zacchaeus' letters. That attack on James was subsequent to that, to the deaths of James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Now, here's an important thing to know. John the Baptist was also killed in 36, according to Josephus. That's a lot of deaths for the movement right there, for the Nazarenes. They lost a lot of leaders that year. That was a very bad year for them. And what do we see happen? After John's death, after the Samaritan massacre, after all that stuff happened, Pilate's removed from power. Herod Antipas is removed just slightly later, a couple of years later, is also removed from power. Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, is also removed from power. We're not told by Josephus why Caiaphas was removed from power. If we read book 1 of Recognitions, which is really from the material there that's talking about these events is really from Zacchaeus. That is the attack on James, the deaths of James and John, and that stuff. We're told there that Caiaphas was the one that hired the enemy that attacked Saul. Now, how do I know that the text is claiming that it was Saul that did this? There's a margin note in a manuscript that says that the original text had Saul's name in there. Now, here's the important thing, because I know I'm going to be criticized. It's already happened, actually. It's like, wait a minute. We don't really know. In the margin note, we can't take seriously. We don't really know that Saul's the one being talked about in Recognition. Okay, that's to me, that's easily disprovable, but let's say that's true. Let's grant that. Abdias of Babylon gives us a little bit more information and says that Saul, also called Paul, attacked James, the brother of Jesus, or James, son of Alphaeus is how he calls him. Papias of Hierapolis understands James, son of Alphaeus to be James, the brother, by the way. And I think Terry Traster has made a very good case that James, son of Alphaeus, and James, the brother, were originally the same, if they were split up. But anyway, I recommend seeing my show with Terry Traster recently on this. But anyway, when you look at these texts, Abdias says that an unnamed man armed with a fuller's club brained James, brother of Jesus. So someone else brained James, son of Alphaeus, after Saul attempted to kill him, but didn't complete his task. We don't know who the unnamed man was armed with the fuller's club. Some of you probably have noticed already, this contradicts what Josephus says massively. Josephus says James, the brother, was killed in 62 at the hands of the high priest, at the command of the high priest, Ananus, son of Ananus, or Hanan ben Hanan. I do believe Josephus wrote the James passage, but my conclusion is Josephus was confused, and he mistakenly thought that the James that was killed by the command of that high priest was James, the brother, when it wasn't. But I think what caused the confusion was that James claimed to be Jesus' brother spiritually. I recommend reading the first and second apocalypses of James, which referred to him as a spiritual brother of Jesus, and not a literal brother, not a physical brother. John Painter compares James in the apocalypses to the James in Josephus, because he says, as he points out, the James in the apocalypse is stoned to death by the authorities, by the Jewish authorities. That's exactly how the James in Josephus is killed. And both texts are saying that James is the spiritual brother of Jesus. Now, he doesn't take it to its conclusion like I do. He doesn't say that's evidence it's a different James. But I say it is. I say it's strong evidence it's a different guy. And to me, some people say it's an interpolation. Most scholars don't think that's an interpolation. I agree with them. I don't think it's an interpolation. I think it's more likely for Josephus to make that mistake than a later interpolator would. A later interpolator making that mistake is very, very, very difficult for me to believe, because by the time that the text would have been interpolated, Origen in the 3rd century is the one that made the James passage popular. When he said that James, the brother, was killed, according to Josephus, that's what's got everybody talking about that passage ever since. Origen made that passage popular. Before Origen in the 3rd century, we don't have a text that mentions that the James and Josephus was the brother of Jesus. Show me a text. You're not going to find it. At least not among the texts that we have. Maybe we'll find something else later that will show that they did. But currently, we lack such text. Right now, Origen's the earliest reference to that passage in Josephus being understood to have mentioned the same James. Beforehand, we don't have it right now. Now, back to what I said earlier, because I'm not done talking about what I think about the historical Paul, but I'm almost done. And that is, what happened to Paul after 36? After all these major players are removed from power, except for Herod Antipas, he gets removed from power in 39, and he dies in Spain. Now, he goes. So Herod Antipas goes to Spain, which is curiously the same. He goes to Hispania, same place Paul goes. That's where I'm going with this. There's a connection between Paul going to Hispania and Herod Antipas, the former tetrarch, going to Hispania. You see my point? So if you look at Paul's movements in the late 30s, they match where Herod Antipas goes in the late 30s, Hispania, farthest west of the empire. Caiaphas is removed from power. Why was he removed from power? Josephus doesn't say. But if you read book 1 of the Recognitions, which is really reusing Zacchaeus' material there, at least for the material that I'm talking about, Zacchaeus gives you the answer. Caiaphas was involved in ordering the assassination of James, the brother of Jesus. That's why he was removed from power. Caiaphas was involved in these horrific incidents. That's what that tells you. That's why he was removed from power. At the same time, Pilate was. And later, Herod Antipas is removed from power too. So there you go.
Well, it looks like we got another question. Very good input, Jacob. What do you think of? Yeah, thank you for the super chat. What do you think about Enochian influence on Paul? That would be the Book of Enoch. What do you make of Simon's theology in the Great Declaration and Paul's own Platonic philosophy? That's a loaded question. By all means, have your liberty. And yeah, I'm excited for this one.
Well, I'll start off by saying that we'd have to look at 1st and 2nd Enoch. 3rd Enoch is much later. That text wouldn't have been known to Paul's letters. I think that they're influential to the degree that the Son of Man is being described as basically being the second power in heaven, which I would say is the precursor to what you see in 3rd Enoch, which finalizes that into referring to Enoch as becoming Metatron. That's not quite discussed in 1st and 2nd Enoch yet, but it is much later in 3rd. But 1st, 2nd Enoch is already planting the seeds for it, what we see in Paul's letters, which Paul's letters definitely make Jesus the second power. Or at least you can see it that way. Jesus is the prototokos, the firstborn of creation in Colossians. Going back to what I was saying about these texts being co-authored, Philippians and Colossians agree with each other on making Jesus a pre-existent being. The other so-called Pauline letters do not do this. Only those 2 letters do. Hebrews also does this, by the way. Now, you go to Philippians and Colossians, what do you see? They're both co-authored by Timothy, by the way. They're both co-authored by Timothy. So I suspect that the idea of a celestial pre-existent Jesus in Philippians and Colossians is actually the result of Timothy's hand. I think Timothy believed that. The co-authors, the other co-authors of these letters, including pseudo-Paul himself, they don't believe this. But Timothy does. Timothy did. And I think Timothy was influenced by Enochic literature when he concluded that. Because Enoch is what 1 and 2 Enoch, they elaborate on the story in Genesis about Enoch being taken up by God, and they're continuing. It's a sequel to that story. It's like, oh, well, here's the rest of the information that, Genesis didn't get around to talking about, but we'll talk about it. We'll clear it up for you. And, Enoch is being turned into basically a god, or a quasi-god, if you want to call him that. And Third Enoch, much, much later, elaborates on that. So what Timothy does in Colossians and Philippians, in my view, is he makes Jesus an equivalent to that. In a form of compete, in a way, like, I think Timothy did this to compete with the Enochic tradition. Like, no, we don't want Enoch to be the second power. Jesus is the second power. That's Vatican. That's my take on
it. There is a way of reading 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 10, about Paul's visit to the third heaven, that would imply that he's. I really resist these theories, what I call the irony dodge, where it says this, but they're just kidding, because it's a good way of trying to harmonize the contradiction. Well, in this passage, they say this is a satire. I forget which scholar in particular said this, but this is a sort of a parody of the book of Enoch, because Paul goes to the third heaven, and it condenses the usual business where Enoch says, and then I saw the treasury of the stars, and where the fallen angels are locked up, and where the snowflakes are warehoused, and so on. And he tells you all of this stuff, which were really just the speculations of the rabbis. And so then Enoch comes back to earth, tells his family about this. They write it down. That's the book of Enoch. And then Enoch goes back up and is transfigured into this gigantic being with hundreds of wings and loads of eyes. I mean, it's really weird. And he is enthroned beside God as the lesser Yahweh and all this stuff. Well, in 2 Corinthians, he says that he was vouchsafed secrets that cannot be expressed, which might mean it was just beyond speech to express, but it might mean what he does go on to say, I'm afraid I can't tell you what they told me. It's classified. And that's kind of a quickie way of saying, yeah, I had these revelations. I know stuff nobody else knows, but of course I'm afraid I can't tell you, because then everybody would know it and I'd lose my privilege. And it's like he's implicitly being made into a charlatan who claims he's a revealer. And so there is Enochian coloring in the passage, but I have to admit the irony dodge in this case does sort of sound good to me, that he knows of that tradition but doesn't like it. But other than that, I'm not, other than the heavenly ascension motif, that's about it.
Well, that's very good input. And just to give you guys a heads up, we're at the 1 hour, almost 40-minute mark. I do want to respect your guys' time. I'm all the way over here in California, so it's only 8:41 over here. But I know you guys, Dr. Price, I think you're in the East Coast, and Jacob, I think that you're in Central Time.
Yes.
But I do believe that we got to all of the questions. Those of you guys that are in the comment section, if you have not, posed a question or a challenge, now is the time to do so. As a matter of fact, I have one from Phantom of the Vegan Fatland. He said, question for both. If Paul's letters are not real and he himself is another made-up character, shouldn't we then go down the whole list of characters in the Bible to prove they also didn't exist?
Well, I don't think Paul was made up. I just think that the letters weren't written by him, but I think Paul existed, as I've been saying throughout the show. I think Paul was killed in 39, which gives me an opportunity to finish my point there. That I think Paul was killed in 39 after Herod Antipas's death, or just about the same time as his death. And I think what happened was that this work in Judea, his attempt to kill James, followed him there. I think he pissed some people off, and the Nazarenes found out where he was, and they took him out. That's my suspicion. I think they found out where he was living in. I guess you can say exile. I think it was kind of an exile, because Herod Antipas was there in exile, and with him gone, and with Caiaphas. We don't know exactly when Caiaphas dies, but I think he was already gone by this point. But regardless, these people aren't in power anymore. They're just gone. There's no one to protect Paul. And he was vulnerable. They found him. They took him out, and that was it. And I think that the original Paul wrote one letter and one gospel report, a very tiny, tiny text. This is about 7-8 verses long, that became the creedal statement in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, notice that it tries to portray Paul, the Paul of the letters, as being part of the story. Whereas the original author of the text is suppressed with the phrase, but according to the scriptures. Like a grapti, according to the scriptures. So what's happening here is 1 Corinthians doesn't want you to know, Paul and Sosthenes did not want you to know that the original author of that creedal statement was actually the real Paul. So it just says, according to the scriptures. But what scriptures? As Rabbi Tovia Singer points out, these are phantom scriptures. These aren't real Old Testament texts. Well, of course they're not real Old Testament texts. I couldn't agree more. You're not going to find that you're not going to find this idea that Jesus is the last Adam, the appearances to keep us at 500 to James anywhere in the Old Testament, or in any text for that matter, anywhere, not even in the Gospels. You can't find it. But you see that when you look at Clement seems to know about content that kind of parallels that, at least the material in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, about there being different parties, Apollos and Cephas, which comes from that one letter that Clement talks about. Now, I think 2 Thessalonians is also critiquing the idea that Jesus is never coming back, because 2 Thessalonians is saying, don't believe a letter as if it were from us that says that the day of the Lord had already come. I think that was put that way because the original Paul never even mentioned Jesus would come back. They would say, Jesus already came. There isn't a second coming. I think 2 Thessalonians was talking about that. I don't even think he was criticizing the idea that the second coming already happened. I think it's even worse. I think it's actually suggesting the original movement didn't have a second coming at all. And that's why it was put that way. But the day of the Lord already came. Like, no, that didn't happen yet. Second coming is coming. But there's not even a second coming. That's why Juan Clement never talks about it. He has to go to the Old Testament. He's got to go over there and find references to the kingdom. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Nina Livesey is the one that, as Bob pointed out, Nina Livesey is the one that says that Paul did not exist, which we don't agree with. I respectfully disagree with her on that. I think he did exist. I think that his existence actually explains why there were so many letters forged in his name. I don't think you're going to put letters into the mouth of someone that didn't exist. But anyway, I'm finished. That's my take.
Oh, about I've already forgotten this. Made up characters. I don't know that we can be sure that there was a historical Paul, that there might have been. or a Peter either. I tend to think the best theory about who the 12 were is that of Robert Eisenman, who says that they seem to be sort of literarily cloned versions of the brethren of Jesus listed in what is it, Mark 3, when Jesus goes back to his hometown and says, "Isn't this the kid that we used to deliver the paper in our neighborhood? Jesus, his father was a carpenter. His brother, aren't his brothers here?" And then it names them. Eisenman says these are the brethren of Jesus, the heirs of the desposunoi, as they're variously called, like James the Just and Simeon Bar Cleophas and Judas Thomas and so on. And that a couple of them, in effect, were caliphs succeeding the absent Jesus. And Eisenman says they were the head honchos, but at some point they were made, they were multiplied so that now we've got the two Jameses, two Judases, Theudas, Bartholomew, Thomas, etc., that they're various versions of the same name, and so that there really weren't 12, and so forth. Well, if that's the case, then the last remaining claim for historicity of New Testament figures or biblical figures, period, seems to fall down. And based on Old Testament minimalism from Thomas L. Thompson, Niels Peter Lemke, and so forth, it seems to me already that none of the Old Testament characters ever existed. And the New Testament characters, I think, probably didn't either. There might have been one or two of them that did, or you could. This is kind of weird, but there's a book where the author is interested in the Theosophical Society of Madame Blavatsky, who claims to be receiving revelations from the ascended masters. And she actually had people drop down folded slips of paper through the air ducts in the rooms she was having these seances and stuff. Oh, here comes another note from Kutumi or Moria L. And here's what he has to say. Who are these people? Well, she came up with a big list of these esoteric masters that now lived in the mountains of Tibet and that were immortal. Well, this author said she didn't exactly just make them up. You can tell from certain clues, I guess, in her letters that these were fake personae she projected onto friends of hers, people she knew from the military or supporters of hers, and she like immortalized them as the ascended masters. And I suddenly thought, is that the way to understand the 12? That that Mark had somebody in mind, but as the apostles, like as they describe, no. Just like when people say that was there a historical Jesus? Well, all the stories about him are made up, but they probably applied them to some guy they knew. I mean, that I think is like a useless inference. Occam's razor cuts that off. It might be the same with every biblical character. There's somebody in the background, but you might as well forget it. As they exist on the page, they never did exist. So anyway.
I do also want to mention another point because I didn't finish this one. That is, where did the death of Paul under Nero come from? I mentioned earlier that Lucius Carinus in the late 2nd century was the source for that story in the Acts of Paul, which is his work. He created that pile of nonsense. One of the reasons he did, among many other reasons, was he wanted to create a fictive story of Paul's death under Nero to glorify Paul. But where did he get it from? Josephus. Josephus mentioned Salusis, remember, Costobarus, and Solus both appeared before Emperor Nero. What was their mission? To convince Emperor Nero that Governor Florus caused the entire war. A very dangerous task, by the way, to do such a thing. Let's just say that Josephus never mentioned the pair ever again. Costobarus and Solus are never mentioned by Josephus after they encountered Nero. While Josephus does not quite say it, I think they were killed by Nero. Josephus, after all, referred to Solus as a wicked man who went around causing all kinds of trouble and mayhem and against the Jews. And they both appear before Nero, and then they're gone. By the way, this was in 66 CE, just shortly after the war broke out. After Cestius Gallus' entire army was laid waste at the start of the war. So Lucius Carinus read that story from Josephus, and he conflated Solus with Paul and concluded that, okay, that's going to serve as the basis for me making up this story that Paul was beheaded, his head gets reattached to his neck, and he's alive again. Yes, his head does get reattached to his neck. It's ridiculous. Like, come on. Like, this is nonsense, and it should be very obvious that it is. But there we go. We got the original Paul died in 39. The Solus Paul conflated guy died in 66. Then is moved around all over the 60s, depending on who thinks when Paul died in the 60s. And then you have Saul from Gascala. And I realize I did not mention how he died in this stream. I think he died in 97. So shortly after he wrote 2 Timothy, because he did, after all, seems to mention that his life spendomai, my life is pouring out of me, to Timothy. And I think he was aging rapidly, and he died of old age. That's it. We covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah,
we did. Let me get to this question really briefly, you guys. Question to both. Have you read Jesus Never Existed by Kenneth Humphreys? If the main character is not real, by default, no one else can be real. And this is all a carefully contrived story. I know we kind of touched on this before, but he just wants to know if you guys ever read the book by Kenneth Humphreys.
I've had Kenneth Humphreys on.
Yeah.
I don't agree with him. His book is interesting, but I don't agree with him. But yeah, I've had him on 5 years ago. Yep.
Nice, very nice. Well, gentlemen, we're reaching the 2-hour mark. Do you guys want to go ahead and give any closing statements? I believe we got to every single question that was in the comment section, and thank you so very much, you guys, for your super chats. So for supporting, Jacob Berman's efforts and Dr. Price's efforts. The insight here is golden. And what can I say? It's scholastic and it's world class, and I'm just delighted to be in the front row and center of this. But do you guys want to go ahead and give any closing statements before we conclude this podcast?
No, I don't have anything further to add, Bob.
The only thing I would say is I regret that the inevitable result of this kind of thing, that a lot of people will hear this and say, I knew that Bible was a lot of bunk, and these guys have proven it. That's sort of true, but it's just sort of the shadow side of the truth. I regard myself, believe it or not, as a kind of defender of the Bible, because to me, the thing is interesting and fascinating for its own sake. Now, are there reprehensible and mythological fantasies in it? Well, yeah, it's an ancient work. I mean, you're asking too much of it to say, "Oh, this is inerrant historical stuff." No, it's not. You're reading. You're trying to read it as a different book than it is. But to me, there is nothing more pious than understanding the text. And I mean, not believing it because you haven't really understood it yet. And that's my sole interest. I find it fascinating. I love it like a classicist loves the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I don't want to see it abused by too high a praise and becoming an idol in its own right. I love the Bible. That motivates me to try to be realistic about it.
So I decided I do have a closing statement, and that is the Pauline epistles. I think they were written from 94, 97 CE, from the final years of Emperor Domitian's reign up to Emperor Nerva's reign. And I think their goal was to remake a historical Paul to suit the needs of the newly formed church in the 90s. There was a huge stress at the time for Christianity. A new religion that finds itself under attack, being caught in the middle of Domitian's much larger persecution of the philosophers in general. And their leadership, major figures in Christianity like Titus Fabius Clemens, being caught in the middle, killed for the excuse that he succumbed to Jewish ways, when I think in reality he was actually killed because he was a candidate for the throne. And that was a threat to Emperor Domitian, and so he had to go from his point of view. And there was a plot to assassinate Domitian. And the more I think about it, I suspect it was really done because they were trying to protect Clement. They were not successful. And Clement was killed anyway. And Domitian's assassination would not happen until shortly thereafter. Paul was an empty vessel. The original Paul was an assassin that they rehabilitated into a positive figure. It gave him a story of a vision he never had, invented the second coming in order to disguise the plot to kill Domitian. That's why Clement knew none of these things yet. Granted that these ideas were created shortly after he wrote his letter, but still, it is after. And they needed to rehabilitate Paul, and they claimed that Paul had a vision and became a better man. They didn't quite invent the story yet that Saul renamed himself Paul to disassociate himself from his past as a persecutor. Abdias of Babylon did say that Saul was called Paul. Zacchaeus referred to Paul as Saul, but not in the same way Acts does. Acts uses the name Saul to rehabilitate Paul as a redemption mechanism. Saul was his days as a bad guy. Paul is now the days of him as a good guy, as a defender of the church, as a defender and promoter of Jesus. Originally, Saul becoming Paul wasn't used to make such a distinction. If anything, the real reason that Paul was called Saul originally was in a negative context. It was to compare him to King Saul of the Old Testament. To say that he persecutes us like King Saul persecuted David, King David. That wasn't a compliment. And there was no mechanism to redeem Paul and to rehabilitate him, not until the epistles come around. And then later Acts finishes it up with its own take. And now Saul becomes Paul. Clement only knew one letter. And aside from that, one tiny creedal statement that Paul wrote that 1 Corinthians quotes and rehabilitates and pretends that Paul didn't even write it. But that somebody else who's pretending to be Paul is quoting from it. Because if you admit that Paul is being quoted in 1 Corinthians, then you're giving a clue that the rest of it isn't actually Paul, but by someone else pretending to be him. Can't have that. The 1 Clement, because the idea hadn't been thought of yet, that there was going to be a second coming of Jesus, He had to mine the Old Testament. He had to find text about a future resurrection, the not a second coming of anyone, but the coming of the kingdom of God, to give the movement hope, to give Christianity hope during the turbulent times, the final years of Emperor Domitian. That's it.
Very good. And those of you guys that have been tuning in, and thank you so very much for your attention. I hope you guys got some good, facts in this.
By the way, I don't
yeah.
mean to cut you off, Tristan. There is one last super chat that we missed.
Oh yeah, yeah. Which one is that?
Let's take that real quick, and then we'll close.
Yeah,
it's the very last one, the very last super chat by Backing.
The very last super chat. Let me go ahead. I apologize for missing it. Let me go ahead and
see. Okay, it happens.
Yeah, I thought I passed.
But we are closing, everybody, so no more super chats, please. So this is the last one we'll take. Just click on starred. That should make you. Okay. Yeah, that'll get you to find it faster.
Yeah, I found it. Yeah, I found it right here. Is it? Yeah. Okay, it says, do you think James is a response? Yeah, thank you for the super chat. Do you think James is a response to Roman Galatians? Galatians.
He
Galatians. Yeah. What about 1st through 3rd John epistles? Where would you put them in? It seems like it's Nazarene literature.
Well, I think that Romans and Galatians, specifically Romans, is indeed in view in James. And in fact, you can actually see that James, whoever he was, had a copy of Romans open in front of him, because he goes on through about 5 verses as we number them in Romans, and says just the opposite. No, he wasn't justified by faith. It was justified by works, and so on. It's very clear that the writer of the letter of James knew the epistle to the Romans and didn't much like it. 1st through 3rd John seems to me to be pretty late in the 1st century, and it opposes a newly hatched heresy, so-called. There's been a schism in the Johannine community, which was a kind of a missionary agency that the elder, which we call John, but no name is given, despite the subsequent title. He was the master of these missionaries and would send them out to different churches, like circuit riders in the Methodist Church, or like Elisha in the Old Testament. They'd make the circuit again and again and prophesy and do whatever was necessary. Well, the elder would send them out, and they'd be honored in the churches. But suddenly the elder gets word that Diotrephes in one of the churches has said to everybody in his church, when the elder's men come around, they've all gone crazy. Just shut the door in their face. And so he doesn't know why. The guy that's writing to the elder, and he says, I knew you'd want to know. And he then fires off a letter, which is our 3rd John, where he says, this guy's all full of himself. He doesn't want any supervision. He wants to be the head honcho. In fact, the brethren have gone out at great risk. We ought to honor them and support them, not slam the door in their face. Then he actually gets in contact with Diotrephes and says, what the hell is going on here? And I said, well, it's because your men started this crazy preaching that Jesus never had a fleshly existence. And he says, what? I never told him that. And they said, well, they're still claiming to represent you. Oh, they are, huh? Well, you were right to shut the door in their face. In fact, I'm going to write to all my churches and tell them to do the same thing. And that way we can smoke these guys out. So second John comes up where he's writing to another of the heads of the church, Curia, the lady, the elect lady, and says, if anybody comes to the door claiming to represent us and says that Jesus didn't come in the flesh, slam that door. So he's adopted the strategy now that he understands it. But he's not going to write to everyone. He says, I don't like to put pen to paper. So he dictates First John. Obviously, the people that numbered them didn't realize what the proper sequence was, and in that he gives a position paper, and he says, if anybody says Jesus didn't come in the flesh, don't listen to them, they're the Antichrist, and so on and so on. So this seems to me to be late first century, and it is trying to smoke out and excommunicate these Gnosticizing representatives of John. And but one other oddity, First John is filled with contradictions. No one born of God is even able to sin because he's born of God, and so on and so on. But then he says, now, if anybody sins, here's what you ought to do. What? How can that be if it's impossible for you to sin? And you find all kinds of contradictions in the Gospel of John. And I think both of these are the results of scribes trying to harmonize variant versions of the Gospel and First John, because after the Johannine mission split, each of them had their own rewritten versions of these two texts. And years down the line, some poor scribe gets them both and says, what is going on here? Which one's the original? And he said, well, I don't know. Well, I guess I'll just weave them both together. Just I don't want to take any chances on eliminating inspired material. And as a result, we have completely confused and confusing Johannine literature. So I think that attests a very late first century date, and that's what the letters are about.
My brief answer to this is I believe John the Elder wrote 1-2 in for John in 97 CE, shortly after Saul from Escala died, as a response against Corinthus. Irenaeus tells us that John confronted Corinthus in Ephesus. I didn't even get to that, but Epiphanius in his Panarion says that Paul confronted Corinthus too. I'm like, well, how does that work in the 50s? That's happening in 97. That's not in the 50s or earlier.
Yeah.
Come on. So, and Epiphanius goes as far as saying that Corinthus is the reason the whole Galatian incident even happened. That's why Galatians was written, because he stirred the pot. Yeah. And I think that the Cephas of Galatians isn't the Cephas in Clement. I think he's actually Simon Bar Cleophas, the Bishop of Jerusalem.
I wouldn't be
surprised. The James in Galatians is actually Corinthus himself. And so what's happening is that these people are being taken and placed in the roles of the original Cephas and James in the 30s. I do not see the letter of James as Nazarene. I could not disagree with that more. That it's Nazarene. First off, the opening statement alone tells me it is a Nazarene. James, the letter of James says that it calls him Jesus Christ. Wouldn't have called him that. They didn't think that. They didn't think of him like that at all. Corinthus, he's an Ebionite. Ebionite's like a breakaway movement of the of the Nazarenes. Almost screwed that up there, but it's a breakaway of the Nazarenes that believes that the Christ. They're responding against Paul's letters, and they're trying to say, actually, okay, fine. We'll integrate the Christ into our belief system, even though we didn't originally think that. And we'll just say that the Christ possessed Jesus at the baptism. That's the ticket. That way, there's still two different people, and Christ possesses them like a demon possesses somebody. And that's how Jesus gets all his powers and all that other all his miracle works and all that stuff comes from the Christ empowering him and taking control of his mind. In the canonical Gospels, it responds against that because Corinthus takes John the Baptist. It wouldn't even surprise me, Bob, you remember me saying this recently, that I think that Corinthus probably created the idea that John baptized Jesus altogether. And then Mark comes around and says, actually, Christ is always Jesus. It's actually the dove that came down. So Mark tries to say somebody else had that role because we can't have Christ Jesus be two different people ever. That's a disaster. He does not want to touch a 10-foot pole. He does not want anything to do with that fiasco. Whereas in the Epistle of James, it's like taking some Christian ideas, but also disagrees with Paul on other ideas and kind of mixing it together. You see what I'm saying, Bob? So it's not totally Torah orthodox. It's a little closer to it, but not quite. It doesn't go all the way with it. That's a problem.
It's Jewish Stoicism, like Fourth Maccabees is.
Sure.
When it's, for instance, the idea that you break one commandment, forget it. You've broken the law. This is just like the Stoic thing. Look, you're either righteous or you're not. If you've got some sin, you're not righteous, buddy. And maybe you'll do that eventually, but I mean, that sounds so similar. And there's other parallels too. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So to conclude, I think that John was trying to refute the idea that Christ and Jesus are two different beings. The way I look at Corinthus is, I think Corinthus, the more I think about it, he probably was behind the idea of Docetism. Now, he didn't believe. Now, don't get me wrong. Corinthus was not a Docetist. I'm not making that claim. But I can see how Docetists might have gotten the idea from him. Like, you know what, Corinthus, that's a cool idea. We're going to go further than you, though. We're going to say this guy wasn't even physical at all. There's nothing physical about Jesus. Just as he tries to say there's nothing physical about Christ, he needed a physical body to possess. Why not go all the way and say Jesus and the Christ were always the same and say none of it's physical? You see my point? It's taking what Corinthus says to to another mile. It's like an upgrade to what he says.
Yeah.
And so John is trying to tackle all of that. I'm like, Corinthus is wrong. He's a heretic. You guys are heretics too. You all suck.
Yes, I think that's correct. Exactly. Well put.
That's it. That's my view.
Yeah,
very nice.
Well,
yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen. One more comment for you, Dr. Price. It says, thank you, and I appreciate Dr. Robert Price. I used to listen to him on shows about 20 years ago, read about the Jesus seminar years prior. Such a fascinating subject. So it looks like Limitless Thinker is giving you a shout out, Dr. Price.
I sure appreciate it.
For sure, for sure. Well, thank you, Jacob, for your input. Yeah, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say thank you for having us on, Tristan.
Oh, of course, of course. And you guys that have been paying attention, you know, this is dynamite, you guys. And I've learned a lot, and I'm going to continue to learn for both of these gentlemen. So I take my hat off to you. You guys are very, very, passionate for this subject, and you've studied the ins and outs and the details, and the fine details, even the crevets and the small little things that have so much significance that most people would just overlook. Right. A lot of the things that you have been presented, most believers and, evangelical conservative Christians, they don't see the gravity just yet. But I think that with persistence, through repetition, and through obviously the genuine passion that you gentlemen have shared, it can reach the hearers. And I think that these questions, these critiques pose serious threats to the conservative evangelical paradigm of Christianity, namely the identity of the Pauline epistles and its authenticity. So thank you so very much, you guys, for this historical groundbreaking, excuse me for that, I look at it like historical. I look at it like it's groundbreaking, and I think it's only a matter of time before more and more people hear this. So thank you so very much, you guys, for your insight and just your overall passion for theology, and Dr. Price, your passion for Bible theology. It's interesting to me as well. So I was a former minister, Bible college and seminary graduate. So you don't get to hear these arguments even in a Bible college world, even in a Christian worldview, and
Yes,
even in a
that's
seminary,
amazing.
you don't get to hear it. So, and Jacob, your insight and just the host of world class scholars that you've had. What can I say? I take my hat off to both you gentlemen, and I wish you all nothing but the best. And I'm looking forward to more content in the future. So thank you so very much for appearing on my podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for having
Anytime.
us, Tristan.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, everyone, for your attention. And by all means, continue to study. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the future holds. So thank you so very much. We'll end it here and have a wonderful night, gentlemen. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
You too.
Bye bye.